Hey everyone, this is lecture 6.1, Theories of Deviance. In this lecture, we're going to be talking about what exactly deviance is from a sociological standpoint and some of the theories surrounding deviance. This is one of those areas where I would strongly suggest that you be sure you understand the material in the textbook, because this is a very, very rich subject area. And I just can't really cover everything in this presentation. So let's first talk about what is deviance. Deviance is a behavior, trait, or belief that departs from a norm and generates a negative reaction in a particular group. That's not a perfect definition, but it's pretty good for our purposes. There is also what's called positive deviance, in which you do something extraordinary that is not expected of you. So that kind of addresses that negative element there. Anyway, defining something as deviant requires us to examine the group's norms and how the group reacts to that behavior. So we have to know what the society or the group believes and what they think is good before we can understand how they think things could be deviant. And what is deviant may or may not be a crime. Here's a thought exercise for you. Just keep this to yourself. Think about what is the most deviant thing you think you've ever done, right? It might have been you broke a law that nobody found out about, or it might be you did something quite serious, right? Then think, did you get caught for that thing? And if you did get caught, what's the worst thing that could have happened had you got caught? And if you didn't get caught, what could have happened? What could have happened in that situation if you did get caught? The reality of the matter is that deviance is, and this is the next slide, deviance is incredibly common. Deviance is intensely common, and most people have committed criminal acts of deviance of one kind or another. I had a professor that I very deeply respected in grad school that put it very plainly. He said, deviance is as common as pigeon shit. And I think that's very accurate. It's not something that we necessarily think is good. It's something that can be gross, but it is absolutely everywhere. And one of the elements sociologists focus on is, why do some people get categorized as being deviant, as being criminals, whatever, but other people do not? That's deeply intriguing to the sociologist. Now let's work through some of our theories of deviance, focusing on our three core theories. So, from the three core theories, each of them has something to say about deviance. Of the three, conflict theory probably has the least to say. Functionalists talk about a thing called Merton's strain theory, and then symbolic interactionists like to put a lot of focus onto what's called labeling theory. There are other theories of deviance that are definitely included in all of this, but I'm not going to be covering it in this presentation particularly. So, I said that conflict theorists don't have much to say about deviance, but they certainly do have some to say. From the conflict theorist standpoint, they would observe that deviance is the result of social conflict, as are almost all things from the conflict theorist standpoint. From this standpoint, then, to maintain their power, the powerful marginalize and criminalize the people who threaten that power. So the people who are in charge, the rich and powerful, the way they maintain that richness and that power is by passing laws that keep people subservient to them, and by getting rid of people that could challenge their authority. Additionally, then, inequality is reproduced in the ways that deviance is defined. This is an important element there. So who do we consider to be the deviant people? Who do we consider to be bad people? Who do we consider to be criminals? And if you think about that to yourself, and we're thoroughly honest with ourselves, we would disproportionately identify poor people, people in minority groups, potentially people in sexual minorities and other minorities. There are a lot of oppressed people who are represented in those groups that we define as being deviant. And that is a major area of concern to conflict theorists. Now, here is an example of an individual who specifically challenged the status quo and was labeled as being a deviant and put in prison. Mr. Eugene Debs was the socialist candidate for president in the years 1900, 1904, 1908, 1912, and 1920. During this era, the Socialist Party was still a third party, so it wasn't one of the major two parties in the United States. However, it did have a pretty significant amount of traction. Socialism didn't have the Cold War stigma on it yet, so people during that era, somewhat similarly to people now, were mediumly confident in calling themselves socialists, right? Eugene Debs said that the class which has the power to rob upon a large scale also has the power to control the government and legalize their robbery. So Debs overtly was challenging the status quo. Debs was overtly challenging the capitalist elite in society, and the government for that matter. And in the year 1918, he was imprisoned for what was then against the law, a crime called sedition. During this era, it was illegal to question the authority of the government in regards to war. Now, in our modern understanding of that, that is a severe violation of the First Amendment to put people in prison for challenging the validity of a war, but that wasn't the understanding during that era. And if you look, and he also encouraged resistance to the World War I draft. It's important to keep in mind that World War I was very much less of the I guess the good versus evil war that World War II was. World War I was a very politically nuanced war. And there were many people in the United States through the whole war that were very much opposed to World War I and the United States' involvement in that. So if you look at the transcripts of Debs's trial, you very much see what is a political show trial. And there is very little doubt from the modern perspective, especially from the conflict perspective, that Debs was put in prison because of his challenging of the powerful elite in society. In the lower left-hand corner of the slide, that is actually a campaign button that Debs had in his 1920 campaign run. Said for president convict number 9653. Debs actually did run for president while he was actively in prison. That isn't something that probably will get you elected in most places, especially in the modern day, but in many parts of the country, especially in that era, there's nothing keeping a convict from running for president or elected office, which again varies from area to area, but is kind of an intriguing idea. Additionally then, conflict theorists are interested in what's called white-collar crime. These are crimes that are committed with the knowledge and resources associated with business. These include crimes such as embezzling, pyramid schemes, also Ponzi schemes, and insider trading. Now, when I say those things, embezzling, pyramid schemes, that stuff, there's a good chance you have no idea what that means, right? You've heard those words, but you don't really understand how it works. And part of that is because we don't see white-collar crimes as being as dangerous as so-called blue-collar crimes. Things like burglary, robbery, whatever, right? You can probably, if I gave you 5 minutes, you could probably come up with a plan on how you would rob a gas station, right? You could probably come up with that. Something like a pyramid scheme, something like embezzling, you'd have to do some research, right? Because in our common understanding, we have stigmatized the crimes of the working class person, of the desperate person, much more than we've stigmatized the crimes of the rich. That is, from a conflict theorist perspective, absolutely something that you would expect to see. Additionally, then, as I alluded to, white-collar crime is a crime of the upper classes, and thus it is not as heavily prosecuted. To roll that in, to restate something I feel I might have missed, to be able to do these crimes, you need to have a certain degree of educational experience, a certain degree of knowledge of the business, and a certain access to the funds of the business to be able to do most of these crimes. Thus, the people that commit these crimes are often in a much more privileged position than those who commit so-called blue-collar crimes. If you're really interested in this idea, there is a documentary on YouTube. It'll probably be on YouTube for the foreseeable future, called The Corporation. It was made in the early 2000s. It is just a smidge dated, but it does a really good job of arguing that not only are corporations the dominant institutions in our society, but that corporations as individuals or as organizations, that they act in a psychopathic way. It's a very interesting documentary, and if you're interested in these conflict theorist ideas, I suggest you check it out. Functionalism then has a much deeper understanding of deviant theory and behavior, and there are a multitude of reasons for that. A big part of it is that this is just something that functionalists tend to be more interested in, and additionally symbolic interactionists are very interested in that too. So, from the functionalist perspective, deviance serves as a function in our society. Deviance serves a purpose. Even criminal deviance serves a purpose. And Durkheim observed that deviance serves the positive social function of clarifying moral boundaries and promoting social cohesion. So when somebody breaks the law, it gives us as a society an opportunity to catch them, to put them in prison, and to point at them and say, you see this is a criminal, this is what we do to criminals, we put criminals in jail. Thus, since we are not in prison, then we are the good people, and thus promoting social cohesion, right? Now, as soon as you start to pull at that a little bit, that facade falls apart. But the reality of the matter is most people never really examine that dynamic. One intensely influential theory in the area of sociological deviance is what's called structural strain theory. This was developed by sociologist Robert Merton. We've discussed him in previous lectures. Merton's strain theory states that there are goals in our society and that people want to achieve those goals. But many people cannot always achieve these goals. This creates stress, or what Merton called strain, because people are aware of the goals, but they do not have the means to achieve those goals. So, and this applied in the broadest sense, the goal in our society is to make a comfortable amount of money, right? Even if you're not a person that's really motivated by money, you want to be able to, say, take your kids to Disney World, drive an okay car, live in a nice house, right? Those are the goals we have in our society. You don't have to be fancy, but these are the things we want. And the means toward achieving those goals, well, that's usually how do you get your money? And for most of us, that means getting a job. Now, before I go further, I do want to point out that there are multiple types of strain theory. This is Merton's structural strain theory. This is the original version of this. If you were to take a deviance course, there are additional strain theories, but this is the original one. And this specific one is very good for explaining why people commit crimes or why people do deviant things surrounding basically the money that they make. So Merton's typology of deviance is as such, and this chart, this is a pretty classic chart. There's one other way that you can lay out this chart, but this is the version I prefer. So we see along the top, we have institutionalized means and we have cultural goals. The institutionalized means being getting a job, effectively. The cultural goals being wanting money. And our responses to that dynamic of, well, I want money and I'm going to go get a job, those are, there are seen as 5 responses that humans have: conformity, innovation, ritualism, retreatism, and rebellion. And in the following slides, we're going to define each of those. So, conformity. This is where most of us fall in terms of Merton's strain theory. By virtue of taking college classes right now, you are doing this, because one of the reasons you are in college is so that in the future you can make some money, probably by having a legal job, right? That is conformist behavior. Now, in the United States, we often have kind of a hang up. We don't like to be conformists, right? We're a country of individualists, but that's not what we're talking about in this situation. We are talking about somebody who says, yes, I want money, so I will get a legal job. That is conformist behavior in this sense. It's not making like a judgment call as far as like you being a boring person or something. That's not what we're talking about here. We're saying you want money, so you go get a job. That's what almost all people do. But there are other people. So the innovator accepts the cultural goal of wanting money, but rejects the cultural goal of getting a legal job, right? Now, it should be stated that the innovator might not have a chance to get a legal job, right? Maybe the innovator grew up in a very underprivileged area, and there are no legal jobs that will get you money. We see this a lot with drug dealers, especially. There just isn't an opportunity, but they want the money, so they find a different way to do it. That is innovator type behavior. However, it should be pointed out that to do innovator behavior, you really have to be breaking the law. You really have to be doing something that is unacceptable by most parts of our society. So if you would open a cupcake food truck and sell the best cupcakes around, you might be doing things a little bit differently, but that's not innovator behavior. That's still having a small business. That's still conformist behavior. What we're talking about here is things like sex work. We're talking about drug dealing. We're talking about embezzling, whatever, that kind of stuff. The crimes that people commit when they are breaking the law to make money. So, ritualist behavior then. This is maybe for most of us the hardest one to understand, because the ritualist accepts that they will do a job, but rejects or doesn't care about making money. So the ritualist likes working or thinks that working is a good thing to do, but when that working does not get them the rewards that most of us would expect, they just keep working, right? And it's again an outside mindset for most people. A very good example of this is, and most of us have probably had some kind of food service job that pays a small amount of money. And many of those jobs are filled by people who are just kind of getting through college, or it's a temporary thing, right? But there are certain people filling those jobs that have been in that job for like 15 years, but they are not managers, right? They're at that lowest level of that job, and they've been doing that for forever. So if you're making minimum wage doing that job, you're not living that comfortable life that most of us want, right? But they keep doing that job and they're not seeking something else out. That's ritualist behavior, is what that really falls into. And there is some nuance that we could put into place here. How do you actually classify somebody who is a social worker or a teacher or other people who do work but are not motivated by money? That's a little bit more nuanced. I'm not going to really get into that. I think really for this circumstance, the easiest one for our understanding is the person that works that low-level job for 20, 30 years. Retreatist then. A retreatist rejects the goal of having money and also rejects the goal of having a job. So they don't accept the society goals and they don't accept the means toward achieving those goals. In the United States, and there are many different ways to be retreatists globally, but the version of this that is most archetypally American is like the mountain man that goes off with a big pile of guns, lives on top of a mountain, and hunts for his own food and grows his own food and might pay taxes but probably doesn't, right? He pulls away from society entirely. He is not interested in having a comfortable life. He just wants to be left alone, and he doesn't want to have a job. He just wants to be left alone, and he's almost always a he, really, in most of these circumstances. That is retreatist behavior, rejecting the goals, rejecting the means. And then we have rebel behavior. And in rebel behavior, they do reject the goals, and they do reject the means, but they create new goals and new means. That is what's happening with rebel behavior. So they don't want to have a job working for a company. They want to reform society in a way that isn't centered on money, and they want to recreate what it means to work, right? We're talking about real visionary kind of people that want to change the world in a lot of ways. You could be talking about a social movement leader, but you could also be talking about like an insurrectionist rebel, maybe even a terrorist. You could be talking about these kind of people too. A big difference between rebels and retreatists is that while retreatists tend to go do their thing all by themselves, rebels tend to find each other and clump together and then sometimes form social movements or rebellions, if you will. Differential association theory, then, this is a symbolic interactionist idea, states that we learn our deviant behavior by associating with deviant peers. So this is one of the social theories where your mom was absolutely right when you were a teenager. If you hang out with bad kids, you're going to have bad behavior. But also, if you hang out with good kids, you're going to have good behavior. Because, and this is another area where in sociology, if you understand what the words in the definition mean, it really helps you. Association, who you hang out with. Differential. Differentials are comparing one thing to another thing, right? So if you compare your behavior to that behavior of the people you associate with, then the people who you associate with will define what you think is good, what you think is bad. So if you associate with people who show up for school an hour early to study algebra, that will be your definition of acceptable behavior. But similarly, if you associate with people who show up to school early to smoke weed behind the bleachers, then, especially in high school, then that would be considered, that would be bad behavior, and you would define what is acceptable and not in that way. And this is another area where if we delve deeper into it in a sociological deviance course, there's a lot more detail there, but this is good enough for you right here. Labeling theory then observes that deviance is caused by external judgments. We call those labels. And these labels that people or society put on us determines our sense of self and our sense of who we think we are and the type of behavior that we consider acceptable for ourselves. And these labels can change our self-concept and the ways that other people respond to us. So if a child from an early age is labeled by their teachers and labeled by their community as being a troublemaker, as being a bad kid, then they will start to take that on as an identity, right? And in doing that, it really sets up that child for deviant behavior in the future that could potentially hurt them, because those first people they were interacting with in their social world were defining them as being bad, as being no good. And that creates self-fulfilling labeling prophecies in which if a child is labeled as being bad, they're gonna be bad. If a child is labeled as being good, they're gonna be good. They're labeled as stupid, they'll assume they are stupid and not try. They're labeled as smart, they will assume that they're smart and they'll try harder. That's how labeling theory works effectively. Those are the ideas there. Labeling theory is a very good example of if you ever have a relationship with a child and you see that there are authority figures labeling that child as being a bad kid, you really have to intervene, really for the sake of that kid's future. Because if that continues for too long, it can lead to some very long-lasting damage to their psyche, their social life, all that stuff. Stigma theory, then, it was explored by Erving Goffman and describes any physical or social attribute that devalues a person or group's identity, and in which it excludes those who are devalued from normal social interaction. So who do we as a society say are the bad people? Who are the criminal people? Who are the dangerous people? Goffman observed. And Goffman was one of the first to observe that these are the people that are discriminated against, right? We often, African American communities, are labeled in areas as being bad, as being dangerous, and thus there are increased police forces placed in those areas. And that creates a feedback loop, because if there's more police in an area, then people are more likely to be arrested because people are watching for that behavior, right? But if there's no police in an area, then probably nobody will be arrested as well. And this is really something that's very much backed up by Goffman's ideas. Similarly, this can be tied to people with disabilities, to people with social or psychological disorders. How do we stigmatize those people? How do we interact with those people that are potentially harmful to them? Those are other things Goffman was interested in. And then closely tied with this concept of passing. Passing is a behavior, Goffman observed, that people do when they are placed in those stigmatized categories, right? So if you belong to a classification of people that there are bad stereotypes about, then you may avoid telling everybody that you're in that category, right? So convicted criminals. I have a friend that when she was in graduate school, she met a guy she really liked. And she dated this guy for about 3 months. And then after that 3 months, he said to her, listen, I have to tell you, I just got out of prison for dealing LSD, right? And he hid that from her because he liked this girl, and he didn't want, because that probably would have stopped the first date from happening, right? So he engaged in that passing behavior to get to the point where he could actually have a human relationship with someone. LGBTQ plus people absolutely have suffered from this, especially in the past. This whole phenomena of gay people and being in the closet, that is the in the closet phenomena is a phenomena of attempting to pass. Additionally, people who have disabilities, especially mental, invisible disabilities, things like ADHD, things like anxiety disorders, those kinds of disabilities that people don't necessarily always see. Sometimes people that have those disabilities won't tell everybody they meet that they have those disabilities. Why? Because there are stigmas associated with those disabilities and identities. And with all of this stigma and passing theory, I just want to re-emphasize, Goffman didn't think this was good. Goffman thought this was deeply troubling, and that's why he studied it. That goes along with a lot of sociological behavior. We often don't study the things that we think are good in society. We study the things that we think we want to try to fix and we want to try to change. Okay, that is it for this lecture. And if you have further questions, just please let me know.